You said yes before the sentence was finished. Not because the request was clear, not because you had weighed what it would cost or examined who was responsible for what was being asked, but because the guilt arrived first, moved faster than thought, and made the decision for you. By the time you understood the full shape of what you had agreed to, the agreement was already signed. Introduction. The feeling of obligation and the proof of obligation are not the same document. One is an internal signal, immediate, pressured, vivid, and the other requires an examination of cause, consent, and capacity. For much of adult life, the signal is treated as the proof, and the examination is skipped entirely. That skipping has a cost that accumulates slowly, then becomes difficult to ignore. Guilt is a capable impersonator. It can wear the face of duty, speak in the language of care, and produce its agreement in your name before you have asked whether the burden belongs to you. This is not an accusation against your character. Intelligent, responsible, morally serious people are particularly vulnerable to this substitution, precisely because they take obligations seriously and cannot easily dismiss internal pressure without feeling that they are becoming someone worse. What follows is a diagnostic, not a permission structure. Nothing here is intended to help you escape genuine duty, avoid real repair, or reclassify every uncomfortable obligation as someone else's problem. The aim is more precise than that. The aim is to give you a way to examine what arrives under the name of responsibility, so that when you say yes, you know which part of you said it, and when you say no, you know what you are actually refusing. That examination begins with a question that most mature adults have never been explicitly taught to ask. When the word responsibility rises inside you, how can you tell whether a real obligation is speaking or whether guilt has already spoken on your behalf? Chapter 1, The Noble Confusion. Real duty does carry weight. A parent watching a child struggle? A person who has made a promise they now find costly to keep? Someone whose professional role places others in their care? Each of these experiences a genuine gravity that is not imaginary and not trivial. The weight is part of what makes responsibility recognizable as responsibility. It signals that something matters, that a failure to act would have real consequences for a real person. But weight alone cannot identify its source. A false burden is just as heavy as a true one. The sensation of obligation in the chest, the sense that something will go wrong if you do not act, the feeling that refusal would make you selfish or negligent, all of these can be produced by genuine duty and by guilt in equal measure. The physical and emotional experience does not by itself tell you which is which. The distinction that matters is between duty you have chosen because you understand its stakes and duty you have been compelled into by the anticipation of internal accusation. Chosen duty may be uncomfortable, demanding, even exhausting, but it retains a quality of authorship. The person accepting it knows at some level what they are taking on. Compelled relief is different. Its goal is to stop the guilt as quickly as possible, and the commitment made along the way is incidental to that goal. What makes this particularly difficult for a certain kind of person is that guilt moves faster than deliberation. Before the request has been evaluated, before alternatives have been considered, before the cost to existing obligations has been estimated, the internal accusation has already arrived. And the only immediately available relief is yes. The accusation is rarely stated in a complete sentence. It arrives as an image, someone's face showing disappointment, a scene in which you are the person who failed, a rapid anticipation of the shame of being called selfish or uncaring. This is not analysis. It is a signal from a part of your experience that has been trained over time to treat other people's discomfort as evidence of your wrongdoing. From that anticipation of disappointment, the internal argument builds quickly. Someone needs something. You are nearby, capable, available, or perhaps simply present. Refusal in this rapid interior reasoning becomes proof of a character deficit rather than a legitimate assessment of responsibility. The logic moves too fast for conscious objection. So the agreement comes before the facts are assembled. Before you know who created the situation, who else could contribute, what it will cost to take it on, or what must be set aside to accommodate it, you have already nodded, already said the words, already begun mentally reorganizing your obligations to make room for one that was never established as yours. The decision was made under pressure, not examination. After the yes, something real does happen. The guilt recedes. This is important to notice. The internal accusation quiets. The imagined disappointment dissolves. The feeling of being a responsible, caring person returns. For a few moments, everything is in order. The relief that follows saying yes when guilt was the requester is genuine, but it is temporary, and its mechanism is what matters. The relief came not because a real duty was fulfilled, but because the guilty feeling was stopped. The two experiences are similar enough in the short term that they are extremely easy to confuse, and this confusion is one of the central mechanisms the rest of this examination is designed to address. After you have said yes, the guilt decreases. The agreement made the accusation stop, and the cessation of that pressure feels like confirmation. It feels as though you did the right thing, because doing the right thing and stopping the guilt produce a similar internal quiet. The problem with using relief as a measure of moral correctness is that relief measures resolution of the uncomfortable feeling, not resolution of an actual obligation. Removing a stone from your shoe produces relief. So does returning a borrowed item. So does apologizing for genuine harm. And so does agreeing to manage a problem that was never yours to manage. The relief cannot tell you which category you are in. What actually happens in most cases is that the burden returns, not always immediately, but consistently. The task is performed, the person is satisfied, the moment passes, and then, because the underlying structure has not changed, a similar request arrives, or the same request in a different form. The yes is expected again, perhaps more quickly, because it arrived without negotiation the first time. Each agreement made under guilt reinforces the reflex. The nervous system learns that the way to resolve this particular kind of internal pressure is to comply. The lesson is not that you evaluated the obligation and found it legitimate. The lesson is that compliance produces relief, and relief is what the system was seeking. This is how a reflex is trained without anyone intending to train it. The origins of that reflex are not accidental, and they are not a character flaw. They were built, usually early, through a series of experiences that seemed at the time to be about love, value, and belonging. To understand where the burden learned your name, it is necessary to go back to where the training began. Chapter 2. How the burden learned your name. Someone noticed that you were dependable. Say a parent, a teacher, a relative, or an employer observed that you completed what you said you would complete, that you showed up when others did not, that your word meant something. They said so. The praise was genuine, and the experience of being seen as capable and trustworthy is not trivial. For many people, it was one of the first experiences of being valued for something they actually did, rather than something they happened to be born. The complication begins when value and usefulness become the same account. When reliability is praised consistently, and only reliability is praised consistently. The developing understanding of what makes you worth something begins to merge with the question of what you can do for someone else. Being a person who is useful becomes indistinguishable from being a person who is valued, and the maintenance of value seems to require the maintenance of usefulness. As usefulness is praised, expectations grow to match it. This is not usually a conscious manipulation. The people around you may have adjusted their reliance on you without awareness that a negotiation should have occurred. The role expanded because you kept filling it, and you kept filling it because filling it was the condition under which you were recognized. What was never adequately separated was appreciation and identity assignment. Being appreciated for your reliability is legitimate. Being told implicitly or explicitly that your identity is your reliability, that who you are is determined by how available you make yourself, is a different transaction. One honors a quality, the other encodes a condition of belonging, and that condition is difficult to question later without feeling that you are threatening the relationship itself. Inside families and long-standing relationships, certain roles take shape through repetition. The provider who never asks for provision in return, the peacemaker who absorbs conflict to protect everyone around them from its discomfort. the caretaker who treats their own needs as secondary to the ongoing project of managing everyone else's. These roles are not assigned through a formal conversation. They emerge from patterns, from who stepped forward when no one else did, from whose stepping forward was accepted without discussion, from the absence of anyone asking whether the arrangement was sustainable. Each time the role is performed, it solidifies. The family system, the team, the household, each of these adjusts around the person occupying the role, and the adjustment makes the role feel more necessary rather than less. The person responsible for keeping the peace discovers that when they fail to perform that function, the peace does not keep itself. This feels like evidence that they are indispensable, but it is equally evidence that an arrangement has formed around their reliability rather than around a shared capacity to manage the situation. The negotiation that was absent at the beginning becomes more difficult to introduce later. To ask whether the role is still appropriate, whether it was ever fairly distributed, whether it can be modified without everything collapsing, this requires questioning an arrangement that everyone involved has come to treat as the natural order. The question feels like aggression, like complaint, like ingratitude, and so it often goes unasked. When a person attempts to exit a role they did not consciously accept, guilt appears immediately. Not because leaving the role constitutes genuine harm, but because the role became identified with duty. And departing from duty carries its own specific pressure. The guilt does not ask whether the role was freely chosen. It simply registers that a familiar performance is ceasing, and it applies whatever pressure has historically worked to restore the pattern. Many of these roles formed under genuine conditions of need. A child who assumed adult responsibilities because a parent was ill or absent. A young adult who became the household's financial anchor because the circumstances required it. A person who stepped into emotional caregiving during a period of family instability because no one else was available and something needed to be done. These roles were not fantasies. They were practical responses to real situations, and the service rendered through them mattered. The difficulty is that roles formed under conditions of genuine need do not automatically dissolve when those conditions change. The family stabilizes. The parent recovers. The financial pressure eases. The crisis passes. But the person who organized themselves around managing the crisis continues to manage, because the role has become part of how they understand their own function. What began as a necessary response becomes an identity, and identity is far more resistant to revision than a task description. Distinguishing historical necessity from current obligation is one of the more demanding cognitive operations in a mature adult's interior life. It requires honoring the legitimacy of what was done in the past. The service was real, the cost was real, the need was real, while simultaneously examining whether the same logic applies in the present circumstances. The answer may sometimes be yes. The role that formed under crisis may still be appropriate, but that determination needs to be made through present examination rather than through the assumption that nothing has changed because the guilt says nothing has. The service given during difficult periods deserves genuine honor. It is not being dismissed or reframed as compulsive. It is being treated with enough seriousness to examine whether it has become a demand that the past makes on the present, regardless of what the present actually requires. Chapter 3. What real responsibility requires. The first question in any serious examination of obligation is whether you caused it. Not whether you are present, not whether you are capable, not whether no one else appears to be taking action, but whether you are the agent whose choices or conduct created the situation that now requires a response. Causation is the most fundamental ground of responsibility, and it is consistently bypassed in the rush to feel useful or to silence guilt. There is an important distinction between being part of a situation and owning its consequences. Influence is not the same as authorship. A manager whose team produces a disappointing result shares in it, but the degree of that share depends on what decisions were made, what was foreseeable, what was communicated, and what resources were provided. A family member whose relative is struggling is not necessarily responsible for the struggle, even if their presence in the person's life is significant. Proximity does not assign causation. In professional settings, the confusion between presence and responsibility generates enormous inefficiency and personal cost. Someone who notices a problem assumes ownership of it without asking who created it. Someone who is asked to fix a situation accepts the framing that the fixing is their job, without examining whether the situation resulted from their choices or from others. In family settings, the same pattern appears. The person who is most responsive becomes the person who is most responsible, regardless of what actually happened. Shared causation is a legitimate category. Many situations involve multiple agents whose choices contributed to the outcome. Shared causation means shared responsibility, but not equal and not total. The examination of causation should result in a proportionate understanding of what contribution is actually owed, rather than a binary assignment that places everything on the person whose guilt is loudest. The second ground of genuine obligation is explicit commitment. What did you actually agree to in language clear enough to constitute a promise? This is a more demanding question than it first appears, because many arrangements that function as commitments were never explicitly stated. They were assumed, implied, absorbed through repetition, or inherited through role. The guilt treats them as formal contracts. The audit must examine whether they ever reached that threshold. Informed consent has a specific meaning in this context. A commitment made under social pressure, under conditions of emotional dependence without knowledge of its long-term implications, or without a realistic understanding of what it would cost. This commitment is more complicated than a freely made, clearly understood agreement. This does not erase the commitment, but it does affect how it should be evaluated, and whether its original terms can be treated as permanently binding under conditions that may have changed substantially. Conditions do change. A commitment made when certain resources, relationships, or capacities were available may have been made in good faith and may now be genuinely difficult to honor under different circumstances. The guilt will not acknowledge this. It will treat the original agreement as if circumstances have not moved, as if time has not passed, as if what was possible then must be maintained now regardless of what has been lost or gained in the interim. A promise is not an infinite license for interpretation. An agreement to help does not automatically encompass every form that help could eventually take. An agreement to be there for someone does not automatically mean being available for every need, at every hour without boundaries of any kind. When the request being made exceeds the scope of what was actually agreed, that expansion deserves explicit examination rather than guilty compliance. The third question is whether you can act effectively. This is not a question about willingness. It is a question about whether taking on this obligation, given your current circumstances, will actually produce the result it promises to produce. Depleted capacity generates depleted performance. An agreement made while already overextended tends to produce a worse result for everyone involved than a clearly bounded offer made with genuine attention and energy available. When you take on an obligation, something else is displaced. This displacement is rarely included in the accounting. The hours, attention, emotional resources, and financial reserves that go toward carrying a burden that may not be yours come from somewhere specific. They come from other obligations, from primary relationships, from work that requires sustained focus, from rest that makes future reliability possible. The displaced priorities are rarely made visible because the guilt focuses only on the failure to help and not on the cost of helping. Where dependents are concerned, the displacement question carries particular weight. Children, elderly relatives, people under genuine care. Their needs constitute real obligations that may take precedence over requests from other adults who are capable of accessing alternative resources or managing their own difficulty. Safety concerns apply in the same direction. When examining an obligation, the question of who else is affected by your accepting or declining it is not a negotiating tactic. It is a moral consideration that belongs in the audit. Personal capacity has limits that guilt does not recognize. Guilt tends to treat limits as excuses, as selfishness in disguise, as evidence that you have not tried hard enough, or cared enough, or been creative enough in finding a solution. These characterizations are not accurate. Limits are real, and exceeding them consistently does not produce virtue. It produces deteriorating performance across every domain the overextended person is trying to maintain. The honest examination of capacity is an act of care, not its absence. With that framework in place, what remains is to look more precisely at the three forms guilt takes, because not all guilt is the same, and treating it as a single phenomenon produces confused responses. Chapter 4. Three guilts. Moral guilt arises after genuine harm. You did something or failed to do something you were specifically responsible for, and the consequence of that action or omission affected another person in a way they neither deserved nor consented to. The guilt that follows is proportionate, not in the sense that it feels measured, but in the sense that it is tracking something real. Something happened. Someone was hurt. The connection between your conduct and that outcome is verifiable. The examination here is evidentiary. What specifically happened? What did you do or fail to do? What was the consequence for the other person? Is the causal link between your conduct and that consequence clear? Or are there contributing factors and complexities that the guilt is omitting? These are not questions designed to let you off a hook. They are questions designed to ensure that the guilt is pointing at the actual event and not at a distorted version of it, shaped by anxiety or self-criticism. Once causation is established and the harm is identified with reasonable clarity, responsibility follows. This responsibility is specific. It is not a license for unlimited self-condemnation, and it is not a demand for impossible restoration. It is an obligation to address what was damaged or lost to the extent that is within your power to address. Repair, in this context, is the appropriate response to moral guilt, not the performance of contrition, not the prolonged punishment of yourself, not the substitution of guilt displays for actual change. Repair is the practical question. What can be done about the harm? The answer may be a direct acknowledgement, a tangible action, a change in behavior, or a combination of all three. The moral guilt that accompanies a real violation is not an enemy. It is information directing you toward accountability. Shame requires a separate note. Guilt and shame are not interchangeable, though they arrive together often enough that they can seem like one experience. Guilt says that you did something harmful. Shame says that you are something defective. The diagnostic that follows is about guilt in the specific sense, the assessment of conduct and its consequences. It does not accept the shame premise because shame is not a moral analysis. It is a verdict about identity, and identity is not what is under examination here. A distinct form of guilt arises when another person is in pain, not because you caused the pain, but because you made a decision they did not want you to make. You established a limit. You declined a request. You ended an arrangement. You told the truth. The other person is unhappy, and the unhappiness is visible, audible, or communicated directly. And your guilt system interprets this unhappiness as evidence of wrongdoing. Causing someone pain and doing something wrong are not the same event, though the guilt treats them as equivalent. Necessary decisions cause pain. Honest conversations cause pain. The maintenance of reasonable limits causes pain. Growth causes pain for people who preferred the previous arrangement. None of these outcomes by themselves constitute harm in the moral sense, because harm in the moral sense requires that what you did was something you owed not to do, given what was agreed, what was caused, and what was within your power. A parent who declines to fund an adult child's ongoing dependency is not causing harm in the moral sense, even if the adult child is genuinely distressed. A person who ends a relationship that has become unsustainable is not causing harm in the moral sense, even if the ending is painful for both parties. A professional who declines to take on additional responsibilities that fall outside their role is not causing harm, even if the request came with visible pressure. The distinction between causing pain and doing wrong is critical, and relational guilt relies on the confusion between them. The exception worth examining is delivery. How something is said or done matters in its own right, separately from whether the decision itself was appropriate. A boundary that was necessary may have been communicated carelessly, harshly, or with insufficient acknowledgement of the other person's experience. In that case, there is something to address, not the decision, but its execution. The relational guilt that accompanies such an event may be pointing at a real and repairable lapse in care rather than at a wrong decision. In cases where the decision was sound and the delivery was reasonably respectful, repair does not require reversal. It may involve a clear acknowledgement of the other person's experience, a patient willingness to hear their response, or a continued presence that demonstrates that the limit does not equal withdrawal. What it does not require is undoing a decision that, on examination, holds. The third form appears when you have deviated from an expected role, not a role you agreed to explicitly, not a role whose demands correspond to a genuine obligation, but a role whose requirements were absorbed through family history, social expectation, long-standing arrangement, or the simple accumulation of time. The guilt announces that you have violated something, but when the violation is examined carefully, no actual harm can be identified. The role was inherited rather than chosen. Provider, peacemaker, emotional anchor, family intermediary, perpetual volunteer, these positions came into existence through repetition and were never subject to formal agreement. The expectations embedded in them are real to the people who hold them. The disappointment when those expectations are not met is genuine, but disappointment and harm are not the same measure, and an inherited expectation is not the same instrument as a deliberate commitment. Running the role-conditioned guilt through the criteria of genuine obligation reveals the difference. Was the arrangement caused by a decision you made freely? Was it agreed to with informed understanding of its terms? Does it fall within your current capacity without displacing obligations that take precedence? When these questions are applied to a role absorbed through years of repetition rather than through deliberate acceptance, the answers are often far less clear than the guilt would suggest. No actual harm follows from your not continuing a role you did not choose. The situation may require adjustment. Other arrangements may need to be found. Other people may need to step forward, and some discomfort will be involved in that transition. But the discomfort of transition is not the same as wrongdoing. The guilt that accompanies role departure is real and often quite intense. That intensity is not evidence that an obligation has been violated. It is evidence of how deeply the role was embedded, and of how much work the language around false duty will have to do before that embedding can be questioned. Chapter 5. The language of false duty. The claim that only you can handle this particular situation is one of the most common structures through which false duty maintains itself. It does not usually arrive as a statement from another person. It arrives as a private conviction, a rapid internal review of alternatives that immediately concludes there are none. The conclusion feels honest. The review was not. Testing the claim requires specificity. What precisely would happen if someone else managed this? Who else exists in the relevant context? Colleagues, family members, community resources, professional services? Who could address some portion of what is being requested? The answer is almost never that no alternative whatsoever exists. The more accurate finding is typically that no alternative is as fast as you, as familiar with the situation as you, as motivated to produce a particular outcome, or as accessible under current arrangements. These are genuine differences. They do not constitute a monopoly. There is a meaningful distinction between being the most competent or best positioned person to handle something and being the only person capable of handling it. The monopoly claim, only I can, elevates the difference between better and exclusive into a false binary. It suggests that all other options are zero options, which is rarely accurate. When the claim is examined this carefully, what it often reveals is not genuine exclusivity, but a standard of quality, a level of control, or an attachment to a particular outcome that no one else would be trusted to deliver in precisely the right way. In workplace settings, this appears frequently in people who never delegate because they are confident that no one else will do the task correctly. In family settings, it appears in the person who manages every logistical and emotional detail, because they are certain that everyone else's approach would be inadequate. In both cases, the claim of exclusivity functions as a justification for unlimited involvement, but the justification rests not on genuine necessity, but on a preference for control that guilt has dressed as care. Learned dependence is also relevant here. When someone has consistently solved a problem, the people around them learn not to solve it. Their capacity may not be diminished, but their expectation that the problem will be solved for them is reinforced with each repetition. The person who accepted the monopoly role contributed, however unintentionally, to the very incapacity they now cite as proof that they cannot step back. The catastrophic prediction is guilt's preferred insurance. If you do not continue, everything will collapse. The project will fail, the family will fragment, the person in need will spiral. The prediction produces urgency, and urgency produces compliance before examination can occur. The first question to ask of the prediction is specific. What precisely fails? Not in general terms, not the vague anxiety that something important will be lost, but concretely. Which specific outcomes would not occur? Which specific person would be harmed in what specific way? By what specific mechanism? On what likely timeline? When the catastrophic prediction is held to a standard of specificity, it often becomes significantly smaller than it appeared. Some of the feared outcomes are real. Many are extrapolations from anxiety rather than evidence of actual risk. Some transitions can be prevented through planning. If there is a genuine period of vulnerability during a transition, a point at which capacity is insufficient, or an arrangement needs to be replaced, that period can often be managed with preparation rather than by preventing the transition entirely. The alternative is not only the catastrophic predicted by guilt or the continuation of the current arrangement exactly as it stands. The third option, in many cases, is a planned transition with appropriate safeguards. Real risks deserve inclusion in this assessment. There are situations in which the prediction of collapse has substance, where genuine dependents have genuine needs, where critical functions genuinely lack alternatives, where safety is a real consideration rather than a projected anxiety. These cases do not require minimization. They require proportionate response. The question is not whether any risk exists, but whether the risk warrants the full continuation of the current arrangement, or whether a more bounded contribution addresses the legitimate concern while releasing what is not genuinely required. This construction is among the most effective guilt formulations because it does not merely pressure a specific behavior, it makes compliance a condition of moral identity. A good person would help. A good person would not say no to this. A good person would find a way. The implicit reverse is always present. Whatever you are doing instead constitutes evidence of deficiency. The first examination is of authorship. Who defined this standard? In most cases, the standard was absorbed rather than chosen. It arrived through family modeling, cultural environment, religious context, peer expectation, or the observed responses of people whose approval mattered. Goodness was operationalized as responsiveness to others, availability for others, sacrifice for others, and that operationalization was never formally authorized or deliberately adopted. It was absorbed, and it now arrives as though it was self-evident. Virtue and infinite service are not equivalent. A person of genuine ethical seriousness holds values, meets real obligations, repairs real harm, maintains honest relationships, and operates with integrity inside the domains where their agency actually applies. None of this requires the absence of limits, the absence of personal priorities, or the permanent subordination of one's own needs and legitimate responsibilities to any request that arrives with sufficient emotional weight. Goodness does not consist of omni-availability. Consider the caregiver who has provided uninterrupted support to an aging parent for several years. The guilt that accompanies any attempt to engage supplementary support, another family member, a professional service, a part-time arrangement, arrives as evidence of moral failure. A good son, a good daughter would simply continue. But the category of goodness that refuses all support, that insists on personal exhaustion as evidence of love, and that cannot acknowledge the caregiver's own needs as legitimate, is not a refined form of virtue. It is a demand structure, masquerading as one. Goodness takes multiple forms. It appears in the meal provided and in the honest conversation that prevents a worse harm. It appears in the help offered and in the clearly stated limit that protects the helper's capacity to continue being reliable. It appears in the yes that is freely given and in the no that prevents a further yes from becoming something hollow. Chapter 6. The moment guilt takes the pen. The most identifiable signature of guilt's agreement is how quickly it arrives, before the full request is stated, before the context is understood, before the alternatives have been considered or the cost to existing commitments has been assessed. The yes appears, spoken or silently formed, as the fastest available way to deactivate the internal alarm. What is typically absent in the moment of rapid agreement is information. Who created this situation? What is the realistic scope of what is being asked? How long will it take? What will it require to set aside? These are not hostile questions. They are the ordinary facts that any person would want before entering an agreement. Their absence from the moment of yes is telling. A genuine obligation can usually be examined. What guilt produces tends to resist that examination because the examination is not the goal. Stopping the alarm is. One practical intervention is to delay the response. Not indefinitely, not as a manipulation, but long enough to permit the information gathering that should have preceded the agreement in the first place. Let me think about this and respond by tomorrow. I need to check what I have on and get back to you. These are not evasions. They are the temporal space within which a real assessment can occur. The guilt will object to the delay, loudly. It will characterize the pause as cruelty, negligence, or selfishness. That objection is itself data. Notice during the delay what the internal accusation says. Does it claim that harm will occur before tomorrow? Does it insist that pausing is already a refusal, already a failure? Does it characterize you as the kind of person who makes others wait when they need something? The content of the accusation during the delay reveals a great deal about whether it is tracking a genuine obligation or operating on a different logic. The discomfort of the delay is not a verdict. It is a sensation produced by a trained system that has associated pausing with wrongdoing. Separating the discomfort from the verdict, experiencing the feeling without treating it as evidence of your guilt, is one of the central competencies this examination is designed to build. When a limit is eventually stated, when a no or a partial offer replaces the reflexive yes, the explanation that accompanies it tends to be far longer than the decision requires. The account of why you cannot do this, the detailed recitation of conflicting obligations, the reassurances that this is not about the other person, the apologies embedded in what should be a simple communication, all of this constitutes an attempt to secure permission for the limit rather than to simply state it. Over-explanation is a bid for absolution. The underlying hope is that if the explanation is complete enough, honest enough, sufficiently detailed about the genuine constraints involved, the other person will release you from the guilt by confirming that the limit was acceptable. The length of the explanation tracks the amount of guilt, not the complexity of the situation. A simple limit about which you feel no guilt requires very little explanation. The same limit about which you feel significant guilt generates a paragraph before it generates a sentence. There is a distinction between offering relevant context and seeking permission. Relevant context is information the other person needs to understand the situation or to identify alternatives. I am committed through the end of next month and cannot add to that right now is context. The extended version that follows, explaining the nature of each commitment, the difficulty of the decision, the depth of your wish that you could help, and the quality of your regard for the person asking. This has crossed from context into a request that the other person perform the function of telling you that you are still a good person. In family settings, this pattern can consume entire conversations. A decision has been made, a limit about visiting frequency, financial contribution, emotional availability. And what follows is not the limit itself, but a prolonged attempt to achieve consensus about the limit before it is implemented. The family member does not need to endorse the limit for the limit to be valid. The search for endorsement is the guilt speaking, not the obligation. Shorter language is often more honest. I can't take that on right now contains a decision. The explanation that follows should serve the other person's understanding, not the speaker's need for relief. When the explanation has been significantly reduced, what remains visible is the actual assessment and whether it holds under examination. You agreed. The words were voluntary. No one coerced the yes in any legal or explicit sense. You said it, and you believed yourself to be agreeing freely. But in the days or weeks that follow, something accumulates that feels distinctly unlike the emotional signature of a freely taken obligation. Resentment, in most of its recognizable forms, indicates that a yes was given by one part of a person while another part was still holding a no. The resentment is a hidden refusal that found no other exit. It does not belong primarily to the person who made the request. They may have asked directly, reasonably, and without pressure, beyond the simple fact of need. The resentment belongs to the gap between what was internally true and what was externally produced. You said yes when some real part of the assessment said something different, and the part that was overruled continues to register its position in the only way available to it. This is not an automatic accusation against the person who asked. Before concluding that the other person extracted something from you they had no right to, it is worth examining whether the limit was ever stated. Did you communicate at any point that the request was at the edge of your capacity? Did you indicate that the help would come at a cost to something else? Did you create any opening through which the other person could have understood what they were actually asking? Resentment can indicate overreach by the requester, but it can equally indicate a failure to communicate limits that would have allowed a different negotiation. What is true, regardless of that assessment, is that resentment appearing after voluntary agreement is information about a recurring pattern rather than an isolated incident. It indicates that the reflexive yes has been operating, that the guilt has been making decisions, that the real internal position is not being communicated. This is not a character failing. It is an observable pattern with a specific history and a specific mechanism. Used as data rather than as a verdict, resentment is one of the clearest signals that the burden audit has been delayed too long. Chapter 7. The Burden Audit. Begin by writing out the obligation as plainly as possible, in language stripped of the emotional intensity that guilt brings to it. Not, "I have to hold everything together or people I love will suffer," but something closer to, "I have been doing the weekly coordination for this arrangement for 4 years." Not, "It's my responsibility to make sure she's okay," but, "I have been the primary person she calls in difficulty." The neutral version is not dismissive of what is at stake. It is precise enough to be examined. Remove identity words from the statement. Words like always only responsible, the one who, and phrases that attach the obligation to your character rather than to a set of specific actions, these belong to guilt's description, not to the duty itself. What remains after those words are extracted is a description of a practice or a set of actions that can be evaluated on its own terms rather than as a statement about who you are. Identify the beneficiary of the obligation with equal specificity. Who exactly receives what is being provided? Is this a specific individual with a particular need, or is it a general expectation held by a group? Is the beneficiary someone whose circumstances make them genuinely dependent on your contribution, or someone for whom your contribution has become a preference rather than a necessity? The beneficiary matters for the proportionality analysis that follows. Identify the stated or implied consequence of not providing what is being asked. Not the guilt's prediction, not catastrophe and collapse and disappointment, but the most honest evidence-based estimate of what would actually follow. This requires some discipline, because guilt's prediction tends to be both more immediate and more absolute than the reality. The consequence may be real, it may be significant, but it is rarely as total as the internal accusation suggests, and naming it accurately is essential for proportionate response. Duration is the final element to state clearly. Is this an obligation with a natural endpoint, or has it been constructed without one? A commitment with a defined duration, a specific project, a particular period of care, a temporary arrangement, is a different thing from an open-ended assumption that has never been formally examined. Many obligations that feel permanent are actually time-limited if the duration is honestly assessed. Knowing the difference changes the nature of the question being answered. With the duty stated plainly, the examination of its source begins. Return to causation. Did you cause the situation that requires this response? Specifically, Not whether you are involved in the life of the person making the request, not whether your choices in the past contributed to the relationship, but whether your conduct produced the particular need that is now being addressed. If the answer is yes, the obligation stands more firmly. If the answer is no, the grounds for the obligation must come from a different source. Look next at agreement. Where does the commitment appear in a form you actually authorized? A conversation, a document, an explicit understanding, something that can be identified as an agreement rather than an expectation that accumulated over time. The absence of explicit agreement does not automatically eliminate the obligation, but it changes the question. If no explicit agreement exists, the obligation is resting on something more diffuse, on precedent, on expectation, on the repetition of a pattern. That is a weaker ground, and it is subject to revision in a way that a clear promise is not. Where the obligation has a legal or institutional dimension, employment agreements, guardianship, contracts, professional scope of practice, that dimension belongs in the assessment. Legal and institutional duties may define what is legitimately yours to carry and what falls outside your official responsibility. This does not resolve every question, because legal duty and moral duty are not always identical, but knowing the institutional boundaries of your role can clarify where a burden is formally assigned and where it has been assumed through habit or social pressure. Safety is a separate consideration. Some obligations are generated not by causation or agreement, but by the vulnerability of the person who needs help and the real risk of harm in the absence of intervention. Where safety is the generating factor, the assessment changes. Not because safety overrides all limits, but because the proximity of harm affects the proportionality of the required response. The question becomes, what contribution to safety is proportionate and within my capacity, and what portion of the situation requires resources or authorities other than myself? Shared responsibility deserves specific attention because guilt tends to single out the person it inhabits and overlook everyone else in the situation. Who else is implicated in this situation? Who else has capacity, proximity, or obligation that is being left unexamined while the assessment focuses entirely on whether you will step forward? Shared responsibility does not eliminate your contribution, but it prevents your contribution from expanding to fill the space left by others' non-participation. Having stated the duty and examined its source, what remains is a question of scale. Not whether any contribution is appropriate, but how large a contribution is proportionate to what has been established. A genuine obligation does not require unlimited accommodation. It requires a response commensurate with the cause, the agreement, the capacity, and the alternatives. Compare the duty as stated with your current capacity honestly, not the theoretical capacity of a rested, resourced person operating under ideal conditions, but the actual capacity of the person you are right now, carrying the other obligations that currently exist with the energy and time and attention that are genuinely available. A proportionate contribution can be made from this assessment. An unexamined yes tends to require the theoretical capacity and draw from the actual one. Identify what would be displaced by accepting the full burden as guilt frames it. Not abstractly, specifically. Which existing obligation would receive less attention? Which relationship would lose access to time and energy currently available to it? Which personal responsibility, to your own well-being, to dependence, to legitimate professional commitment, would be diminished? The displacement that guilt does not account for belongs in the accounting. Alternatives deserve a place in the measurement. What other resources exist? What portion of the situation could be addressed through means other than your direct involvement? A partial contribution that identifies and connects with other resources may serve the actual need more sustainably than a full assumption of the burden that gradually depletes until the involvement becomes unreliable. Before recording the result of this audit, there is a private question worth pausing on. Write down one duty you currently recognize as genuinely yours, one that you can state without needing to mention anyone's disappointment in you, without referencing what someone will think if you fail to fulfill it, and without needing the approval of anyone else to confirm that it is real. Keep this for yourself. It is not a public declaration. It is a measurement of where your own accountability actually stands, separate from what guilt has been volunteering. Record the guilt that remains after the audit separately from the audit's conclusions. If the assessment has determined that a burden is not proportionately yours and the guilt continues anyway, as it often will, note the guilt without treating it as a correction to the assessment. The guilt is real. It may be intense. It is not on its own evidence that the assessment was wrong. What the residual guilt actually costs across time and context is what the next part of this examination addresses directly. Chapter 8. The cost of carrying what is not yours. Tasks accumulate. A particular kind of adult life has a specific texture. The schedule that contains no space that has not been assigned. The inbox that holds everyone else's urgent priorities. The domestic calendar organized around needs that are rarely the person managing it. When enough unexamined obligations have been accepted over enough time, the accumulation reaches a point where the individual items are no longer visible as separate decisions. The condition is simply what life looks like. As the accumulation grows, what existed before it begins to compress. Projects that required sustained attention get fragmented. Relationships that required genuine presence get allocated whatever remains after all other demands have been met. Personal priorities, work of real meaning, creative practice, the maintenance of friendships, rest adequate to support continued function, move progressively down the list until they occupy a permanent position at the bottom of it. These displacements feel abstract when stated this way. They are not abstract in the life of the person experiencing them. The quality of what is provided under these conditions is not the same as the quality of what is provided from a position of adequate resource. The person who is handling too much handles everything less well. Attention is rationed, care becomes procedural. The help offered is real in its intention and diminished in its execution. The irony of carrying false burdens in the name of being reliable is that the carrying erodes the very reliability it was meant to demonstrate. No medical claim is being made here. The language being used describes observable patterns in adult, professional, and domestic life. A person who has consistently oversold their availability and undersold their limits does not perform reliably. Their performance under accumulation is a legitimate question, not a judgment of their character, but an honest assessment of what unlimited voluntary obligation eventually produces. Professionally, the pattern is often recognizable in the person who is always in the office, always the one asked, always the one who stays late, and whose work, measured carefully, shows signs of the toll the availability takes. The availability is impressive, the sustainability is not. In domestic contexts, the equivalent is the person who manages every detail of shared life and gradually becomes a system that runs but no longer connects, present in function and increasingly absent in the sense of being genuinely there. The connection between depletion and resentment has already been noted, but its direction here is specific. Depletion is not only a personal cost, it is a cost paid by the people who depend on the depleted person's genuine rather than procedural engagement. The most significant relationships, those built on something more than the management of tasks, are frequently the ones that receive what is left over after the false burdens have taken their share. The people who consistently receive rescue from a particular person often develop, over time, an expectation of rescue that does not require any conscious decision on their part. The expectation is learned. The arrangement functions from their perspective because the pattern has been reliable. They are not necessarily calculating or exploitative. They have simply organized themselves around an availability that was never formally defined as limited. There is a careful distinction to draw between genuine incapacity and learned non-participation. Some people who appear unable to manage a task cannot manage it because of real limitations, physical, cognitive, practical, circumstantial. Others do not manage it because they have not needed to, because the person who takes on the false burden has consistently removed the need. These are different situations, and conflating them leads either to requiring too much of someone who genuinely cannot perform, or to indefinitely maintaining someone else's avoidance of development. The rewards for learned dependence are not one-sided. The person who carries the burden often receives something in return: indispensability, a particular relationship quality, a sense of purpose that is tied to being needed, a form of belonging that depends on continued provision. This is not a contemptuous observation, it is an honest one. Understanding why the arrangement persists involves examining both sides of what is being maintained. Moving toward a different arrangement does not require contempt for the person who has become dependent, nor does it require a sudden withdrawal that leaves genuine needs unaddressed. What it requires is a gradual return of manageable responsibility, tasks and decisions that are genuinely within the other person's capacity, alongside enough patience to allow the learning that will necessarily involve some difficulty and some error. Error is part of the learning. Preventing all error prevents the development that would eventually reduce the dependence. The permission to make mistakes for someone who has been consistently rescued is itself a form of respect. It treats the other person as capable of navigating difficulty, rather than as someone who requires permanent management. In this specific sense, the refusal to carry a false burden may be a greater gift than the carrying ever was. When obligation is not chosen but simply accumulated, when the yes was issued by guilt before deliberation occurred, the experience of carrying the responsibility has a particular character. The work may be performed. The obligations may be honored, in the technical sense of tasks completed and commitments met. But the sense of authorship, of having decided to do this, of understanding why, of choosing this over alternatives, is absent. The responsibility exists without the choice that would give it meaning. Underneath the performed competence, something else tends to accumulate, not always visible in the performance, not always available to conscious inspection, but present in the quality of attention, in the threshold of irritability, in the response to requests that arrive on difficult days. The anger that belongs to the uncounted cost of uncounted obligations tends not to disappear. It tends to appear where it was not expected, in interactions that should not carry it, directed at people who did not produce it. Promises extracted from guilt rather than from deliberate commitment tend to be unreliable over time, not because the person making them lacks integrity, but because the promises exceed what the person actually has to give. The commitment was made from a position of temporary compliance rather than genuine assessment, and what it promised was drawn from a reserve that has since been depleted by the other commitments made in the same way. The reliability that guilt was trying to protect is precisely what this mechanism tends to erode. Restoring choice to obligation is not the same as abandoning the obligation. It is examining what was taken on, determining what genuinely holds under the three criteria, and making an explicit decision about what to carry forward. This yes, that no, this other one, partially and for a defined period. The choice that follows examination is qualitatively different from the compliance that followed the alarm. It may lead to the same actions in some cases. The difference is in who signed the agreement. Genuine obligations are preserved in this process. The audit is not designed to produce a life emptied of responsibility. Where the criteria of causation, agreement, and capacity identify a real obligation, that obligation is carried forward with clarity rather than confusion. The purpose of the examination is to ensure that what remains is owned, recognized, deliberate, and sustainable, rather than simply heavy. Chapter 9. The necessary no-naming. What is not being assumed requires a different kind of language than guilt typically produces. Not a performance of regret, not an extended apology that restores the burden through the back door. A clear statement of what will not be taken on, delivered without hostility toward the person who expected it. This is not something I'm going to be able to manage. That one isn't mine to carry, as I understand the situation. The clarity is not unkindness. The unkindness would be in a yes that eventually fails. Avoiding accusation preserves the relationship sufficiently to allow a different arrangement to emerge. The refusal is about the burden, not about the person who brought it. Framing the limit as a decision about capacity and appropriate scope, rather than as a characterization of the requester's conduct, allows the conversation to continue in a productive direction. The other person may still be disappointed. The disappointment can be received without either collapsing the limit or generating a counterattack. Where it is genuine and proportionate, a bounded offer has value. I won't take on the full management of this, but I can help you find someone who can. That's outside what I've agreed to, but here's what I can actually contribute. The bounded offer is not a compromise that partially restores the false burden. It is a response that identifies what is legitimately within scope and offers that specifically without the surrounding accumulation that guilt would have added. The consequences of the refusal will arrive. Some of them will require attention. The transition from an arrangement in which a false burden was carried to one in which it is not is rarely frictionless, and pretending otherwise would itself be a form of false promise. What happens next? How the other person responds, how the situation adjusts, what new arrangements may need to be found, belongs to the following examination. The other person reacts. This was predictable. Disappointment, frustration, hurt, reproach, the reaction is real. And it is not manufactured to manipulate you, even when it lands with precision on exactly the guilt that makes limits most difficult. People are genuinely affected by changes in arrangements they have depended on, and their feelings are not fraudulent simply because those feelings create pressure. The reaction is not a moral verdict on the limit. It is a response to a change. Separating these two things, the person's distress and the legitimacy of the decision, requires maintaining the distinction even as the pressure builds to treat the distress as evidence of wrongdoing. Someone's pain is real and does not by itself constitute proof that you were wrong. This is a hard distinction to hold in the moment because the guilt system will interpret the other person's reaction as precisely that kind of proof. The immediate reversal is the most common error at this stage. The no was stated. The reaction arrived. The guilt increased. And to stop the guilt, the original position is modified, softened, or abandoned, not because new information was provided, not because the assessment changed, but because the emotional pressure became uncomfortable enough to require resolution. This is guilt's mechanism, completing its circuit. Resisting the reversal does not require coldness. It requires holding the ground while remaining present to the other person's experience. Respectful contact can continue through a limit. Acknowledging that the other person is disappointed, that the change is difficult, that their expectation was not unreasonable given the prior arrangement. None of this concedes the limit itself. It maintains a quality of regard that honors the relationship without restoring the burden. The presence of care within the limit is what makes the limit something other than abandonment. The energy that has been recovered through refusing a false burden now belongs to something. The specific question is, what genuinely legitimate obligations can now be served more fully? A parent who has been distributing attention across an unsustainable range of inherited responsibilities may find that the children who actually depend on them receive more of what they need. A professional who has reduced their scope of false availability may find that the work falling within their actual responsibility improves in quality and reliability. Reliability within genuine scope is worth communicating explicitly. The message to those who depend on what is actually yours to provide should be clear and consistent. This I will do. This I will maintain. Within this range, my commitment is real and my capacity supports it. That kind of explicit reliability is more valuable than the diffuse availability that tries to accommodate everything and eventually serves nothing well. Scope needs to be communicated when the arrangement has changed. If others have formed expectations around a previous level of availability, they need to understand what the current scope looks like. This communication is not a negotiation for approval. It is an informational exchange that allows everyone to adjust their planning accordingly. The communication can be brief. It does not require extensive justification or apology. It requires honesty about what has changed. Review points serve a practical function. Legitimate obligations themselves change. A commitment that was appropriate last year may require modification. A partial contribution that was defined as temporary may have naturally concluded. Building in periodic assessment of whether current commitments remain calibrated to causation, agreement, and capacity prevents the slow accumulation from restarting and keeps the arrangement something that is continuously owned rather than quietly resumed. Chapter 10. When guilt is true. There is conduct to account for. A decision was made, something was said or left undone, and the consequence of that decision landed on another person in a way that was real and that you were specifically positioned to have prevented or managed differently. Naming this requires directness that does not reach for abstraction. Not I may not have always communicated as well as I could have, but something closer to what actually happened, stated without excessive rhetorical softening. The self-excusing abstraction is one of the most consistent obstacles to genuine accountability. It is distinct from false guilt, which claims responsibility where none exists. The abstraction performs remorse without locating the specific act. It allows a person to feel like they have addressed a harm without the discomfort of stating what they actually did. The discomfort of specificity is precisely where genuine accountability lives. The general acknowledgement that one is imperfect is not repair. Intent and impact deserve to be distinguished, but the distinction runs in a specific direction. Having intended no harm does not eliminate the impact. The harm occurred whether or not it was the goal. The intent matters for understanding what kind of error occurred. A careless one, a thoughtless one, a one in which someone pursued a legitimate objective without adequately weighing its effects on others. But it does not change the fact of the impact or reduce the responsibility to address it. Good intentions without attention to consequence are a partial defense at most. Gathering the relevant facts is not the same as building a case for your innocence. The facts include the timeline of events, the information available at the time, the reasonable expectations of the other person, and the actual consequences that followed. Having the facts does not resolve the guilt. It gives the guilt something real to work with, rather than allowing it to expand indefinitely into territory it was not tracking. A specific apology is different from a general expression of regret. I'm sorry I wasn't clearer about what I needed when I made that decision, and I understand that left you in a difficult position is different from I'm sorry if you felt hurt by anything I did. The specific version identifies the action, acknowledges the consequence, and addresses the person, rather than the discomfort of the apologizer. Its goal is the other person's experience, not the removal of internal pressure. What can be restored should be restored to the extent of your practical ability. If something concrete was damaged, a relationship damaged by a broken promise, a project set back by your absence, a confidence violated by your disclosure, the question of what can be practically repaired deserves honest examination. Not symbolic gesture in place of actual effort, but genuine attention to what would constitute a real reversal or reduction of the harm caused. In some cases, the harm cannot be fully repaired. That limit belongs in the apology alongside the genuine attempt. The limits of repair are real and need to be accepted. Some damage cannot be undone. Some relationships cannot be fully restored. Some losses cannot be compensated. Accepting this is not the same as avoiding accountability. It is an honest encounter with the irreversibility that some forms of harm carry. The guilt that remains after genuine effort to repair is not evidence that more must be done. It may simply be the weight of an irreversible consequence, and that weight is not punishment to escape, but information to carry into future conduct. Demanding forgiveness is a way of making repair about the person who caused the harm rather than the person who experienced it. Forgiveness belongs to the other person, on their timeline according to their own process. An apology that includes an implicit or explicit expectation of resolution that ends with hope of being released has shifted the focus away from accountability and toward the apologizer's comfort. The repair stands without requiring the other person to perform the conclusion. The behavior that produced the harm can change, not through declaration, not through the promise to be different, through actual, observable differences in how the same kind of situation is handled when it arises again. The change in conduct is the part of the apology that the other person can eventually see rather than only hear. It is also the part that is most difficult to counterfeit over time. The discomfort of knowing that a harm occurred, that an apology has been offered, and that the other person's response remains uncertain. This discomfort is appropriate. Sitting with it without immediately seeking relief through further apology, through gestures designed to accelerate forgiveness, or through a return to the subject that serves the need to feel resolved, is part of what genuine accountability requires. The discomfort is not a problem to be solved. It is the reasonable cost of having created a situation that now requires time to move through. Endless self-punishment is not more accountable than appropriate accountability. It is less functional. A person who has accepted responsibility clearly, made whatever repair was possible, changed the relevant conduct and committed to accountability going forward, this person does not serve the harmed individual better by continuing to condemn themselves. The ongoing self-punishment has a particular way of returning attention to the person who caused the harm, rather than allowing the relationship to move, if it chooses to move, towards something new. Inviting accountability means remaining open to future feedback. If the same harm recurs in a different form, or if the impact of the original harm continues to emerge over time, remaining available to hear that, without defensiveness, without immediately explaining, is part of the commitment that genuine repair involves. It is not an open invitation for unlimited review of all past conduct. It is a signal that the accountability is ongoing rather than performed and concluded. Learning from consequence is distinct from ruminating over it. The consequence of a genuine harm carries information about what was not adequately considered, what assumption failed, what value was not being appropriately weighted. That information belongs to future judgment. Extracting it deliberately, understanding specifically what it says about a pattern or a gap, is more valuable than simply experiencing the discomfort of having caused harm without drawing the lesson that would change future conduct. The guilt that follows real harm is worth hearing until it has said what it actually knows. Final chapter. Living with guilt that is not a verdict. After a correct decision, the guilt may not depart. A limit was examined, the audit was conducted honestly, the conclusion was proportionate, and the refusal was communicated respectfully, and the guilt is still present, possibly as intense as it was before any of the examination occurred. This is one of the most disorienting discoveries available in this entire process. The feeling was supposed to indicate wrongdoing. The examination found no wrongdoing. The feeling has not updated. The demand for emotional certainty, the expectation that a correct decision will produce an inner state of peace and confidence that confirms its correctness, is one of guilt's most effective secondary instruments. When the peace does not arrive, the guilt reframes its absence as evidence that the decision was wrong. The emotional state becomes the arbiter of the moral analysis, but the emotional state is a product of conditioning, history, and the training of the reflexes discussed earlier. It is not a real-time measurement of whether a genuine obligation was violated. The evidence established through the audit does not require emotional confirmation to remain valid. The assessment can be reviewed. If there is something that was missed, a relevant fact, a misapplication of the criteria, a consequence that was underestimated, that review is appropriate. But the review should be based on new information or a genuine recognition of analytical error, not on the discomfort of the guilt itself as the sole grounds for re-examination. When the guilt is persistent and significant, when it continues beyond what any self-examination has been able to address, seeking support from a trusted person or a qualified professional is not a sign of inadequacy. The accumulated weight of conditioned guilt, particularly in adults who have carried the responsible role for many decades, can exceed what an internal examination can adequately process. That is not a failure of this framework. It is an honest acknowledgement of the limits of what any framework can accomplish alone. The first experiences of not intervening in a situation where you formerly would have intervened feel wrong in a way that has very little to do with whether intervening was actually right. The absence of motion where motion was habitual is registered as omission, as failure, as a kind of deliberate harm. Unfamiliar non-intervention and wrong non-intervention feel nearly identical in the early stages of withdrawal, which is precisely why they require a different kind of attention rather than simply a different feeling. The urge to rescue will arrive on schedule when the situation appears. It will not wait to be invited. Someone will struggle with something that you could manage, and the internal system that has been managing it will observe the struggle and generate the full familiar pressure to act. Noticing this urge without immediately following it is the specific skill under development. The noticing is not indifference, it is the space in which a more deliberate response becomes possible. Allowing others to act, to attempt, to adjust, to find their own approach to the difficulty is not abandonment. It is the restoration of an autonomy that may have been, however gently, undermined by the consistency with which you previously absorbed the difficulty before they could engage with it. Their process will be different from yours. It may be slower, less efficient, less thorough by your assessment. Those differences are part of what genuine capability development requires. Genuine obligations within the old role are maintained. Withdrawal from the conditioned portion of the role does not require or justify withdrawal from what was legitimately yours to carry. The child's real needs continue to be met. The professional responsibility within actual scope continues to be honored. The promise that was genuinely made continues to be kept. The line between what was conditioned and what was chosen becomes more visible as the withdrawal proceeds. New evidence accumulates during withdrawal. In many cases, the feared consequences do not materialize in the form or the degree that guilt predicted. Others manage, situations adjust, people develop capacity that was not visible before because you were managing it for them. This evidence does not eliminate the discomfort of the withdrawal, but it belongs in the running assessment, and over time it revises the guilt's catastrophic predictions in a direction that is more accurate. The accountability that follows from this entire examination is different from the accountability guilt produced. It is chosen. The obligations it encompasses are ones whose causation, consent, and capacity have been examined and affirmed. They belong to a person who has looked at them clearly and decided in their own name to carry them. Not because the guilt became too loud, not because the alternative was socially impossible, but because the examination confirmed that this genuinely belongs to you. Chosen accountability has limits, not as a deficiency, not as a grudging compromise, but as an accurate representation of what is real. A limit that is stated clearly is more reliable than an unlimited commitment that gradually becomes hollow. The person who says, "This is what I will do specifically within this time frame with these resources," is more accountable than the person who says yes to everything and delivers what the accumulated burden allows, which is inevitably less than the promise. Repair belongs within chosen accountability. Where genuine harm has occurred, the commitment to address it is part of what responsible adulthood requires, and no framework designed for honest adults would omit it. The repair is specific, proportionate, and oriented toward the harmed person's experience rather than toward the relief of the person accountable. It does not demand forgiveness. It does not expect to purchase a clean record. It simply addresses, as honestly as possible, what can be addressed. Consent governs the forward commitments. Future agreements are examined before they are made. The request is heard, the facts are gathered, the criteria are applied, and the decision, yes, no, or a bounded offer, is made from deliberation rather than from alarm. This does not guarantee that every decision will be correct. It guarantees that the decision will belong to you rather than to a reflexive process operating faster than awareness. Present capacity is the measure used, not theoretical capacity or historical capacity or the capacity of the person the guilt insists you should be. What is available now given current obligations and current resources is what informs the scope of the commitment. This is not a permission to underperform on genuine duty. It is an honest accounting of what sustainable responsibility actually looks like from where you are standing. Epilogue. The name on the burden. The request that opened this examination arrives again. Someone needs something, and you are nearby, and the internal alarm is beginning its familiar sequence. But something has been built since the first time you heard it, a set of questions, a procedure, a language for the examination that did not exist before. Apply it now to this specific request. Who caused the situation? What was actually agreed to? What is genuinely within your capacity without displacing something that takes precedence? The examination takes more time than the reflexive yes, And that time is exactly what it is supposed to take. From that examination, one of three positions becomes available. Yes, that holds because the causation, the agreement, and the capacity all confirm a genuine obligation, stated with clarity about scope and duration, not offered as an unlimited accommodation to stop the guilt. A no that holds because the audit found no legitimate ground, stated without excessive justification, without accusation, and with a bounded alternative if one genuinely exists. Or a partial offer, proportionate to what the examination identified as a real but bounded contribution. All three are responsible positions. The one that guilt would have produced, fast, total, unexamined, is no longer the only available response. The master loop closes here, not with the guarantee of peace, but with the competency to distinguish. When the word responsibility rises inside you, you now have a procedure, not a formula that produces certainty, but a series of questions that make the difference between genuine obligation and conditioned guilt visible enough to act on. Whether a real obligation is speaking or guilt has already spoken on your behalf, these are no longer identical experiences. They can be examined, and the examination is now yours to conduct. Treat the guilt that follows a limit as information rather than verdict. It is pointing at something, a trained expectation, a role that was vacated, a relationship that is adjusting, a person who is experiencing disappointment. All of these things are real, and none of them automatically constitute moral wrongdoing. The guilt signal is worth receiving. Its interpretation is what requires examination rather than automatic acceptance. Testing the guilt against the responsibility criteria is the ongoing procedure. When guilt arrives after a decision, the response is not suppression or dismissal. It is the audit. Did this decision involve a situation I caused? Did it break a genuine agreement? Did it require something beyond my honest capacity? Or did it displace an obligation that takes precedence over this one? Running the guilt through these questions converts it from an immediate verdict into a piece of evidence that can be assessed alongside other evidence. Denying guilt automatic authority is not the same as becoming indifferent to it. A person who has worked through this examination is more responsive to genuine guilt, not less, because the framework that separates moral guilt from relational guilt from role-conditioned guilt makes it possible to hear what each variety is actually reporting. The guilt that follows genuine harm is worth full attention. The guilt that follows the disruption of a conditioned role is worth a different kind of response. Automatic authority was never what made guilt useful. Examined guilt, placed within a framework of genuine accountability, is the more capable instrument. Consider one burden you accepted before examining whether it was yours. Not the most dramatic one, not the one that requires an immediate and public decision, simply one that, in the light of everything covered here, you now recognize as a weight you took on before the source was identified, before the agreement was located, before the capacity was honestly assessed. You do not need to share the answer. It is enough to know it, to hold it clearly, and to bring the same questions to it that you have learned to bring to the others. If something in that recognition is worth putting into words, a specific pattern you now see differently, a burden whose name you can finally read clearly, the space below this belongs to that. Not a performance of transformation, not a summary of everything that was said, but one precise thing that the examination clarified. Brief is sufficient. The precision matters more than the length. What tends to follow the recognition of a conditioned yes is a different and more demanding question. Why does the thinking continue even after the answer is already clear? Why does the mind return to a resolved question and reconsider it, rebuild the case for the other position, locate new grounds for the original guilt, even when the analysis has already concluded? That is the territory this examination connects to next. The thinking that continues after the answer becomes costly has its own mechanism, its own history, and its own diagnostic. The next part of this work is called the delay index, and it begins where the analysis should have ended.